Hey there, hard rockers. Hope everybody had a good Halloween. Thought I'd get back to some more excerpts from the chapters in this great book, Nothing But a Good Time. I'm just absolutely loving this. If you remember the last few I did, and maybe you don't, I don't know, we've got several new subscribers on the channel. Yay, thank you. Anyway, I've been sharing some chapters from this book. I got it from the library so I could decide if I want to buy it. I am definitely going to buy it because it's awesome. I recommend you buy it too. If you don't understand why, maybe watch this rest of this video and go back a few to some other ones where I've gone over chapters from this book, and you'll see if you like this kind of music. Wow, is this great? This is so great. This is a lot of the stuff that if you were around in the 80s and you were into this kind of music and you went out and you bought those rock magazines, you know, Hit Parade or Circus, Faces, Rip, all that stuff. This is the information you didn't actually get in those interviews that the bands did, but that you later kind of figured out this sort of thing might be going on, instead of just what you were being told about how wonderful everything was and how much they loved their new album and the other guys in their band. There's a lot more truth in this book than I think we got back in those magazines, and it's just fascinating. So anyway, so far I have gone over, I have read, started with a chapter about kind of Dokken's whole formation, and then we talked a little bit about the 1983, or actually 1984, Bark at the Moon, Shout at the Devil tour with Ozzy and Motley Crue, which was fascinating, I must say. We also talked about how kind of interwoven and connected all of those early 80s LA musicians were with each other. Jake, Warren, and George Lynch being a perfect example of that, and really interesting stuff. Now, I'm still working on the book, but I recently came upon some more. It's actually 3 different chapters that I'm going to read from today, all having to do with RATT specifically. And you'll maybe understand why they're sort of connected as I go through this. Okay, so anyway, we're going to start with chapter 17. It's called When You've Got Nothing, You've Got Nothing to Lose. And this is basically the story of how RATT classic lineup kind of wound up getting together. All right, Bobby Blotzer. I went down to Hollywood to see RATT play the Whiskey, and I wasn't quite into the band. I was waiting for this other gig to open up in a band called Beaujour. They were amazing, but with RATT, I saw that there was potential in the band, but I wasn't really fond of Pearcy as a frontman, you know. But by this time, months had gone by, and these Bruiser guys were fucking lingering. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but I kind of guess it made him unhappy. Juan Crucier. Bobby called me one day and said, "Hey, I want to go jam with the guys from RATT." I guess this might have been when Crucier was still associated with Dokken, maybe, and was waiting around for something to happen with that. Anyway, Bobby called me one day and said, "Hey, I want to go jam with the guys from RATT." They had a rehearsal space in this garage in the backyard of this house. Um, and I think he's talking there about the rehearsal space that Stephen Pearcy shows in those documentary pieces that I recently talked about on the channel a little bit. Anyway, I think the lady's name who lived there was Mrs. O'Neill. So Bob goes, "Can you take me up there?" Because I had a little pickup truck. So I said, "Yeah, no problem. Maybe buy me a burger and I'll give you a ride." I don't think he ever bought me the burger. Bobby Blotzer. So in March of '82, I joined RATT just to play. Juan Crucier. Then about 2 weeks after that, he calls me and he goes, "Hey man, I need you to help me out. I can't play with this bass player. I'm going to kill him. Can you come down and jam with us?" And, I was a starving musician. So I go, "How much is the band making?" "I think we make about $50 a gig." And I went, $50? I'm in. That was groceries for a week. And so RATT began basically from there. Bobby Blotzer. We rehearsed in that garage in Culver City for like a year and a half, maybe. And that's where we wrote a lot of that stuff. Warren DeMartini. RATT was starting to do better. And what happened was Dee Dee, who was booking for the whiskey, had seen RATT, and she had an idea that it could be something. So Saxon was playing the whiskey, and I think the opening act couldn't make it or something like that. But I remember it was very quick, like that day. You got to get your stuff to the whiskey. We got a chance to play, and they were doing 2 shows in one night, totally packed and sold out. And we got up there and played, and it was the first time we'd ever played to that many people and got the response that we got. That was a turning point. Stephen Pearcy. Eventually, we became a house band at the whiskey, just like Motley. Interesting that some of the guys in RATT always seem to kind of go, just like Motley. Dee Dee Keel. I tended more toward the pretty boys. I liked a band that would go up there and put on costumes. I loved the circus. So as soon as I heard about RATT, I got them into the whiskey as fast as I could, and I really thought they had great tunes. They didn't take off or get the attention as fast as Motley Crue, but if I had to score them, they'd be number 2 for sure. People were coming, particularly girls. And Steven, have you ever met him? My girlfriend was with me once and she said, "Oh my God, this guy just exudes sex. He touches, he's all over, and particularly if he wants something." Stephen Pearcy. We didn't really eat, but I had girls taking care of us, feeding us, giving us stage clothes, bailing us out of jail. Bobby Blotzer. And then it started getting big. I was starting to trip out. I was really getting a buzz off of it. We were packing the whiskey, sellouts, 2 nights at the Troubadour, everywhere we played around SoCal. Warren DeMartini. But even though things were doing better, we never really got paid, There was no manager or anything like that. I remember one night at the Troubadour, this was after that Saxon gig, and it was like we'd seen with Motley Crue, where there's a line going around the corner. We did 2 shows, both totally full, and when we were done, it was like, where's the guy with the money? When Marshall started managing RATT, that stuff didn't happen anymore. Bobby Blotzer. Marshall was managing the whiskey at the time, and I knew who Marshall Burrell was. He was somewhat infamous. He had been on the scene since the 60s and shit. He worked with the Beach Boys. He worked with Creedence. He was like legendary. Marshall Burrell, former manager of RATT and Van Halen. I go back to 1960 when I started at the William Morris office in the music department. I signed the Beach Boys. I brought Van Halen to Warner Brothers. I had an office at the Whiskey, and one of the girls there told me about Ratt. Dee Dee Keel, that would have been me. Marshall Burrell, they had some great songs and they had a huge following already. I personally liked them. But I always go by what the people see, you know? So cementing the relationship and wanting to sign them was based on the reaction of the audience toward them. Dee Dee Keel, when Marshall got his hands on Ratt, he got involved pretty heavily. And Stephen Pearcy was the kind of guy who would walk on people's shoulders to their head, to the next lily pad, if you will. So you could see that coming a mile away. But I can remember telling Stephen, ride that pony as far as it takes you. Stephen Pearcy, if I'm correct, we were doing a whiskey show and Marshall just came up and introduced himself. He said, hey, I used to manage Van Halen. We go, Van Halen? Marshall Burrell, I didn't bring Van Halen to Warner Brothers. I brought Warner Brothers to Van Halen. I had a relationship with Ted Templeman, and Ted Templeman and Mo Austin and one other guy from Warner Brothers came to the Starwood. I told the band I was bringing some people down, and it was pouring rain. Of course, David Lee Roth likes to tell it different. I don't want to get into all that. The bottom line is I did my job. I did what I said I was going to do. Bobby Blotzer, Marshall, he's a little old school shifty, you know, but God bless him. Stephen Pearcy, all we heard was, I was Van Halen's manager for 2 tours. I can get you in the studio. Marshall Burrell, even if I hadn't worked with Van Halen, here's a bunch of guys on the street. You offer them a record deal, I'm sure they're going to take it no matter what. Stephen Pearcy, we talked because everyone was getting signed at that time, but we still had nothing going on. Juan Crucier, Marshall had a label called Time Coast and offered Ratt sort of a production deal. And back then, it was just a different world. Oftentimes, groups that really had nothing going on were offered these deals that were maybe not the most lucrative deals. But when you've got nothing, you know, you've got nothing to lose. Bobby Blotzer. So we did this EP in 1 week in November of '82. I forget the name of the studio. It was on Melrose. Stephen Pearcy. I think that record only cost something like $3,000. Bobby Blotzer. I remember walking out of that studio Thanksgiving morning after mixing that record for a day and a half straight, and I had to go to my in-laws for Thanksgiving. I was so fucking tired. I got in my Datsun B210, pulled the seat back, put my feet outside the window, and went to sleep. But the record sounded killer. Stephen Pearcy. The artwork was Robin and I throwing live rats on Tony Katane's legs at Neil, I'm going to butcher this name. I've never been able to pronounce it. Zlauzers? I don't know how to pronounce his name. You know, Neil Z, the famous photographer for rock bands, on Tony Katane's legs at Neil Z's studio. She was Robin's girlfriend. Neil Z. These weren't wild rats that we found in the gutter or something like that. They were rented from, as Stephen called it, a place called Rent-A-Rat. I'm like, dude, they got a place that rents rats? He goes, yeah. Stephen Pearcy, it was just some weird idea. Get some rats, throw them on our legs. It'll be kind of creepy. So we did. And Tony was a little squeamish, but she went with it. She was a trooper. The only thing was, we rented 5 white rats. But if you look closely at the cover, there's a 6th one, black. Don't know where that came from. Juan Crucier. That was one of the things we were always kind of laughing about. Like, hey, man, didn't we have 5? How come there's 6 in there now? Neil Z. I've got to be honest with you. I'm an animal lover. Probably the best pets I ever had in my life were pet rats. I loved them. So I don't know whose idea the whole thing was, but it wasn't mine. Marshall Burrell. I hired some promotion men to get the EP some legs in LA, and it took off like crazy. I did what any record company would do, which was number one, get some airplay. We got it into heavy rotation. Bobby Blotzer, KLOS and KMET, in an unprecedented move, they were both playing You Think You're Tough. Juan Crucier. It was like, whoa, we're on the radio. I'm driving down Prospect Avenue in Redondo Beach, and here comes You Think You're Tough. And I thought, oh, yes. And you know, the fans picked up on it. We sold somewhere in the neighborhood of 40,000 copies on our own as an independent band. And that's what helped to bring about the Atlantic deal. Marshall Burrell. My experience after Van Halen and before Ratt was that there was a lot of independent record activity going on. I was helping out the Go-Go's, and I saw how all the bands were promoting themselves. That's what needed to be done to get interest from the labels. But you sell 40,000, 50,000 units, somebody's going to jump all over that. Bobby Blotzer. And that led us to the Beverly Theater, July 27, 1983. That's when we got our deal. Stephen Pearcy. Lita Ford was also supposed to play, but she pulled out because she didn't want to open for Ratt. We said, we don't care. We'll just play alone. And that's what we did. Bobby Blotzer. She was trying to show up late and fuck with us somehow. This is the story we were told. But we just went on. We said, fuck it. She showed up, but it was too late. Stephen Pearcy. And that's when the president of Atlantic came down with a couple of his guys. Beau Hill, Ratt's producer, of course, also produced Kix, Alice Cooper, Twisted Sister, Warrant, and Winger. I had worked on a Sandy Stewart record for Modern Records, which was a subsidiary of Atlantic. And one day I got a call from then Atlantic Records president, Doug Morris. We've been through this. He said, are you willing to go to California with me to look at a band? Because if you'll produce them, I'll sign them. Warren DeMartini. I remember a feeling that it was this or nothing, because my memory is that every label had passed on us, and Atlantic was the last big one that hadn't seen us yet. Stephen Pearcy. Marshall had been instigating meetings, having labels come and check us out, major labels, and a lot of people didn't want to deal with us. Beau Hill. So we flew out and we saw Ratt play at the Beverly Theater, and the place was packed. There were 2,000 screaming kids, and they're going completely nuts. Stephen Pearcy. And then it was done. Next thing you know, we're signing contracts with Atlantic Records. Marshall Burrell. Doug and Beau came backstage after the show. Bing, bang, boom. That was it. Okay, so that's the end of that chapter. And then we get to chapter 21, which is actually a chapter about Warrant, the band Warrant. It's called It's Hard to Believe, but at that time, Janie was really kind of shy. But the reason I'm getting into part of this chapter, it's another little tidbit about Warren DeMartini from Ratt. Max Asher, who was playing drums for Warrant, says in kind of a little ways into this chapter, I came up with the name Warrant right around that time. We were huge Ratt fans, and the name Warrant comes from Warren DeMartini. I'm thinking Warren and Warrant, and I pitched the name and everybody likes it. Warren DeMartini. I remember that I was at the intersection of Franklin and Highland at a red light, and this kid was putting up flyers on telephone poles, and he's like, "Are you Warren DeMartini?" I said, "Yeah." He hands me a flyer and goes, "My name's Josh. I like your playing. I'm in this band Warrant, and we named the band after you." I was totally blown away. Now, the Josh is Josh Lewis, but I thought that was kind of fun. Um, Never heard that before. I did not know that. That's cool. Okay, so anyway, then we get to chapter 22, called "Everybody Would Be Throwing Up, Passing Out, Hallucinating, or Banging Outside." Sounds promising, right? Okay, so Warren DeMartini. "Doug Morris told me he signed Ratt because of Round and Round. He thought that song could go the distance." Stephen Pearcy. "Round and Round was written in the living room at Ratt Mansion West. A couple of guitars, 2 tape decks, and me, Warren, and Robin sitting around throwing ideas back and forth." Warren DeMartini. "I was refining that riff all the time. And then when we all lived together at Ratt Mansion West, I was practicing one day and playing the riff, and Robin and Stephen were like, 'What's that?' And we just gathered around in a circle, and in 30 minutes, we had what you hear today." Stephen Pearcy. "I had rented a 1-bedroom apartment pretty close to the strip, and me, Warren, and Robin all lived there. So did all of our gear and a couple of our roadies. And we decided to call it Ratt Mansion West. People actually thought we lived in this huge mansion." Warren DeMartini. "It was this 2-level apartment building in North Culver City that kind of wrapped around a crummy old swimming pool. And it was not unusual for it to be like 2:30 in the morning and half of the troubadour would show up. All of a sudden, it's an after party." Stephen Pearcy. "They were just crazy parties, man. Anybody and everybody would show up. It could be Wasp, it could be David Lee Roth, it could be Dio. I remember one time we had that mountain booze that's like 150 proof and that you could light on fire and shit. What was it called? Everclear. We'd get some containers of that, do some fire tricks, pass that around, and by the time it got late, everybody would be throwing up, passing out, hallucinating, or banging outside. If you wanted to be where shit was going down, you either went to the Motley House or Ratt Mansion West." Funny, Stephen, when Stephen says that about the fire tricks with Everclear, I remember being at the drive-in one night in my small town I grew up in, and somebody had built a fire outside toward the back of the drive-in property, and a bunch of us were standing around it drinking at like the age of 15 or something. And somebody, I don't remember who it was now, somebody was drinking Everclear, and well, probably several of us were. Anyway, one of these guys has to go, pulls it out, starts peeing on the fire. Well, bad idea, because the fire followed the stream up to him. And somebody, I remember one of the other guys there, or a couple maybe, just lunging at him and shoving him away from the fire to stop it before he was wasted. He didn't even know it. But I remember watching that actually happen. It was crazy. Everclear is the real deal, boys and girls. Anyway, thought I'd throw that in there. Sorry. Bobby Blotzer. We would party there all the time. Then they had chicks that would come over and bring them food and cook and all that. Stephen Pearcy. So we had Round and Round done in probably a day and a half at Ratt Mansion West. And then Bo got a hold of it and he went, "That's the first song you're going to record." And it was like, wait a minute, we've got heavier songs. We've got better songs. Nope, that's it. That's your song. Bobby Blotzer. We started recording out of the cellar in September of '83 at the Village Recorder. We were in the big room, which Fleetwood Mac had spent $2 million to completely remodel. It was insane. Bo Hill. Everybody in the band hated me, because Doug made it very clear that if I didn't do the record, they're not going on Atlantic. Juan Crucier. We talked about different producers, but Beau Hill was Doug Morris's hot new producer. Warren DeMartini, I remember it was like, we think it would be great if you tried working with Beau. Beau Hill, on a visceral level, I felt bad for them because they were put in the position of having to trust a completely unknown quantity. And in all fairness and honesty, I was not a proven producer at all. I was still learning. I mean, I knew how to be in a band. I knew how to engineer. I knew the mechanisms of all that stuff. But the subtlety and psychology of herding the cats was something that was on the job training for me, basically. Stephen Pearcy, in the studio, I was always mojoed down somewhere with somebody, in cupboards, in rooms closed up, under things. They had to look for me all the time, see where I was at. And then they'd find me and say, time for you to sing. I'd say, okay. Juan Crucier. There were people coming and going. There were beautiful girls showing up. There was some partying, if you will. But 99.99% of the time, we stayed really focused on making that record. I was generally easy to find. Warren DeMartini, I remember that we finished the record and then there was months of nothing, you know? It seemed like huge gaps of not much happening. Then suddenly we get a call that we have to be at this address downtown to shoot a video. Okay, so there you have multiple chapters having to do, at least in some way, with the Ratt guys and kind of how they got together. And I just think all that stuff's really fascinating because that's the kind of stuff, you know, for some reason, at least the way I remember it when I read them, those 80s rock mags, they would have some really interesting, cool interviews. I remember loving a bunch of them, but you never got information this deep, at least not back then. And maybe that was part of the deal. You just didn't, like if you were in one of these bands, if you were their publicist and the record company and management and stuff, you didn't want them giving away that much detail of whatever struggle there was in the beginning, or, you know, obviously you wouldn't want them discussing, you wouldn't want Bobby Blotzer saying in Circus, well, I don't really think of much of Steven as a front man. I mean, I'm not crazy about him saying that in public now. So in 1985 or something, that just would not work. But yeah, I thought that was pretty cool. So wanted to get that out there. And that fits in really well. If you didn't watch a couple of videos ago, the one with Jake, Warren, and George Lynch, you should go back and watch a little bit of that and hear some of the stuff out of that chapter, because it's really interesting. In that one, Jake talks about how, or maybe it's Warren, Jake talks about how he talked Warren into moving to LA from San Diego to audition for Ratt. And then Warren mentions like, yeah, I was like, maybe I'm thinking about going to college, but maybe I'll come up, you know, on the weekend or something. And they're like, no, you got to go today. We've got gigs this weekend that we need you to be part of. So Warren says, you know, I went up there with nothing but my guitar and the chords to Round and Round. But then in this chapter that I just read from, you hear about, you know, how those chords were kind of accidentally maybe introduced to Robin and Steven, who were sort of the main songwriters in Ratt, and that went from there. But yeah, I thought that was really interesting. All right, well, I mean, you know, let me know what you think down in the comments again, as always, and we'll talk to you later, Hard Rockers. Have fun.